ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. There's things we know, there's things we don't know. One of the things we do not know is how to cure it. There is no cure. We do know that those who have served in the military are twice as likely to be diagnosed with ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. At a certain point, I had a theory, and so I looked it up, and sure enough, firefighters are being diagnosed more and more with Lou Gehrig's disease. Then later I looked up police officers. Sure enough, police officers are also being diagnosed more and more. According to numbers I looked up the other day, Asian Americans, 18.2% of Asian Americans are being diagnosed. Or that's the way the number is offered, 18.2%. African Americans, 13.6%. Caucasian, white, 12.1%. The general age range of diagnosis has been 40 to 70 years. More recently, younger and younger people are being diagnosed. People in their 20s, people in their 30s, male and female. The average age of diagnosis has for a long time been 55, but if more and more young people are being diagnosed, then we have to reconsider that number as being the average. So, bottom line is, what do those in the military, because it doesn't matter what branch of military someone has served in, it's anyone who has served. So we have to figure out, what do those in the military have in common that the general population does not? And the one thing that came to my mind right away a while back is the food. The food they eat, they have in common. Also, take that a step further or a step back, and you're talking about food possibly with greater monosodium glutamate content. So that's to be considered. Also, the process that takes place in the brain when it comes to ALS is simulating what takes place when we are embalmed. The way that the chemicals of embalming work on the brain, you can almost see it reflected in the destruction that takes place in the brain, the living brain, when ALS becomes the diagnosis. So aside from those in the military eating the same food, the other similarity, or the other thing that they have in common, is that if in a prior life, and that's not to say that every life becomes just one the next time, but we're talking about an autoimmune reaction that takes place when in the brain makes glutamate. And it is said that glutamate can be excitatory, which basically means something's taking place that is autoimmune. It's when the immune system turns on the body. So in this case, it's turning on the brain, much in the same way that the chemicals of embalming affect the brain when we are embalmed. Now, we can get caught up on the idea that we are intentionally creating warriors to live each next life as warriors yet again, and we can stay there. But the more important consideration should be that These are people who have served before and who were embalmed, and that's where we can see that energy in the new life, in the new body, is becoming autoimmune at earlier and earlier ages. And it's simulating the effects of the chemicals of embalming the last time. If glutamate is made in the brain, then we have to consider the monosodium glutamate as a toxin to some people. So in other words, long before anybody's diagnosed with ALS, nobody knows that monosodium glutamate, if it builds up enough, it is going to bring about an immunoresponse that is actually autoimmune. And that's when it turns on itself and starts simulating the chemical processes that take place during embalming. Now, what those who have served have in common, once again, is they died and were likely embalmed almost immediately. If they were not embalmed immediately, they were put on ice so that they could be embalmed as soon as possible. This has been a practice. This has been intentional. Not necessarily by the embalmers, but by those who began all these practices here in the United States. That would be pretty much the Civil War in the time of Lincoln, okay? And that's when we begin to see disease really ramping up in this country. Now, those who have served, they get embalmed immediately, or they're getting an industrial strength version of embalming fluid. I'm thinking it's more that it is immediate. They're being embalmed immediately, which disallows the process of decomposition. Decomposition is crucial to the optimal evolution of humankind. In other words, we learn from our previous lives. It doesn't matter if we were just one person, because there's something called deadfall, and we'll talk about that later. But I'm going to wrap this up. I think I've said enough for the moment. This is rough stuff to digest. I've had to digest it pretty much alone. I have a few people I've been able to talk to, so that's been good. But you're talking about the numbers for ALS are much lower than those of Alzheimer's, which tells me that people with Alzheimer's who end up being diagnosed with Alzheimer's, that's either the run-of-the-mill embalming fluid, or they weren't embalmed as quickly, as immediately. So maybe 2 days later, 3 days later. But what embalming, the objective that embalming really has had for centuries now, is to create disease in the next life and to create an earlier death, as we can see. Embalming is not necessary. It is not natural. It is the work of snakes